Chris Hedges, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thanks, Jyotish.
I want to start with Gaza. I interviewed Norman Finkelstein last night, and my last question was kind of hoping against hope kind of question, asking for what's the way forward. And Norman, who generally likes to give you long answers, he said, I don't know. There is no Gaza. What's your response on that? And tell us, how do you look at Gaza at this moment?
Well, we know what the Israeli intent is, but even Israel doesn't know whether it can be achieved. So that's why Norman answered the way he did. Israel's intent is to completely destroy and ethnically cleanse Gaza. It is close to achieving that in the north, just destroyed one of the last major hospitals, including taking the director of the hospital hostage, even though he was wounded. Complete siege, cutting off all food. We don't know how many people are there. The rescue groups can't even get to areas that are bombed, and then they're off under attack. But it's clear that they will depopulate the north and resettle it, recolonize it. They would like to push the Palestinians, some 2 million of whom are living in destitution in the south, ideally into the Sinai, into the Egyptian Sinai. The Egyptian government has been adamant that they won't take them. I understand. I've been in Egypt. I've been in the Middle East a fair bit since the genocide began on October 7th or shortly after October 7th. And Egyptian journalists were telling me that the military has really been unequivocal with Sisi, saying that it is absolutely impossible for the Egyptian government to acquiesce to the demands to accept refugees. But I think the goal is to create a humanitarian crisis that is so catastrophic. There's no clean water. They have been cutting aid and food shipments, including in the south. And there's virtually nothing. I mean, maybe a few trucks here and there, but nothing getting into the north. But they've severely curtailed aid and food shipments to the south. There's infectious diseases, breakdown of civil authority. So you've seen gangs in desperation, looting, the few aid trucks to get in. I mean, this is just what Israel wants. They want to sustain this humanitarian crisis. And I think their hope is that will put pressure somewhere on the international community to depopulate southern Gaza. In terms of Gaza existing, no, it's been completely decimated. It would drop the equivalent of 2 nuclear weapons in terms of explosive devices on a very small area. Gaza's only 5 miles wide and 20 miles long. And just to juxtapose the saturation bombing that Israel has carried out, I was in Sarajevo during the war in Bosnia. We were being hit with 200 to 300 shells a day, constant sniper fire. And, I still have nightmares about it. It was really horrible. That resulted in 4 to 5 dead a day and about 2 dozen wounded a day. Well, compare that to Gaza. It's not uncommon that you get a day where 150 Palestinians, and these are recorded numbers, who are killed or wounded. But of course, the real numbers are much higher. I worked in Gaza for a long time. I covered the Middle East for 7 years, so I spent significant time living in Gaza and reporting on it.
There was also the Lancet survey, which fits somewhere 175,
right.
180,000.
Yeah. Well, the only numbers that are recorded are those that are registered in morgues and hospitals, which don't exist. There aren't many of them left. And I have colleagues or friends in Gaza who we would hear from periodically. Now we don't hear from at all. It's been weeks. one assumes they're under the rubble. And then you have, with the destruction of entire apartment buildings, those people are buried and they're not recorded. So I have a good friend, Atif Abu Saif, who is a great Palestinian novelist. He's from Gaza. He was in Gaza on October 7th. He got trapped there with his teenage son, Yasser, who's 15, I think, for 85 days, and wrote a really powerful book called Don't Look Left, which is translated into English, about that, the 85 days in Gaza. Well, he lost his sister-in-law, the whole family. They're not recorded as dead. So the numbers are far, far higher than I don't know what the current figure is, 45,000 roughly. It's far, far higher than that. Some people say it's 200,000, but it's certainly significant. But yes, Gaza doesn't exist. All of the universities have been destroyed. 80% of the mosques have been destroyed. And let's be clear, this is intentional. And then there's been a constant targeting of the intellectual elite, which is what colonizers always do. They wipe out that artistic intellectual class, those who are especially bicultural, like Rifat al-Hariri, the great Palestinian poet, who was targeted. And we know he was targeted because he was getting all sorts of death threats and ominous messages from Israeli accounts. He moved constantly and then finally was killed with an Israeli missile strike in his sister's apartment. And he was somebody who, he wrote that great poem in 2011, If I Must Die, which then he re-released shortly before he was murdered. This is, genocide always includes not just physical erasure, but erasure of culture, erasure of history, and the targeting of those who are able to transmit that culture either through art, either through journalism. Over 200 journalists have been killed. To be honest, having spent so long in Gaza, and then I think also having been in Sarajevo, so I know what it feels like, it's been really horrible to sit and watch this live-streamed genocide and see the fact that the world in real time can see it and do nothing. That's probably the real lesson of the Holocaust. They don't care. The Holocaust, the Nazis tried to hide the Holocaust, and that wasn't true in the Armenian genocide. It was very public. There were constant front-page newspaper stories, and the U.S. ambassador Morgenthau was, issuing report after report, so that people understood in real time what was happening to the Armenians. I think there you had, finally in the end, 1.2 million killed. I used to work in southeastern Turkey, covering the PKK. And I would see on these hilltops the remains of these Armenian villages that had been destroyed, Armenian churches. None are left, actually, in southeastern Turkey. But they're not, it's like stumbling, I also worked in Israel, stumbling upon the remains of the Palestinian villages. They're not even recognized on maps. They've been they've been destroyed and erased as entities. I think it has so many echoes of the Armenian genocide to me, and the utter indifference, not the indifference of most of the world, but the complicity of the former, and not accidentally, the former colonizers. Those countries like the United States, Britain, Germany, that carried out genocide. Of course, the Germans with Herero in modern-day Namibia. And then later the Jews. We carried out a vicious campaign against indigenous Americans, by the end 90% of whom were killed. So these old, and then Britain, India, Kenya, which a lot of people don't recognize how brutal the purported war against the Mau Mau was in Kenya. So Ireland, also very brutal, people forget. So it's I find this kind of coalition of former settler colonial states that in the face of revulsion of their own public. I mean, 77% of registered Democrats want an arms embargo on Israel. It doesn't matter. They don't care. That gets into the whole distortions of the American political system and the way the Israel lobby has bought off, in particular, Congress. So, yeah, I mean, I like Norman a lot. He likened the October 7th assault to Nat Turner's slave. I thought that was a really good historical analogy, which doesn't, none of us are trying to defend the atrocities that were committed. But, Nat Turner murdered every white he saw, man, woman, or child. And when you are trapped in a concentration camp, which is what Gaza in essence was, remember, these people couldn't leave, they couldn't work. I've been in Gaza, I've been in Han Yunis, Jabalia. You have 10, 12 men sleeping on the floor of a room, a concrete floor in a hovel. They can't find work. They have no source of income. They're relying on UNRWA or on Hamas charities to survive. They can't get married because they don't have any financial resources. And you shut off every avenue by which they can affirm or express themselves. And the only avenue the oppressor leaves open to them is to be a shaheed or a martyr. Mm-hmm. And on that day, if you are a martyr, then they put your bend to these, if you have the body or if you don't have the body, but bend to these, they're not funerals, but these kind of memorial events. They'll block off a street, they put out white plastic chairs, they'll put a picture of the martyr on the wall. That's the only way left. They have to be someone, to affirm their being. And they break through that barrier, and they do what any of us would have done. It's this incoherent rage. And people talk about the rave party and the killings that went on there. But remember, those people could hear that music. It was so close to the border of Gaza that the people trapped in this open-air prison could hear it. We should also acknowledge that Israel is responsible for a significant number of the killings of Israelis, because they were the Hamas and other resistance groups managed to take out the electronic monitoring system, so the Israelis were flying blind, and they just shot at any vehicle headed back into Gaza, many of which, of course, did carry Israelis. They ordered strikes on Erez, which is the Israeli border crossing going into, which I crossed many times, going into Gaza, with their own soldiers inside. So it's it's clear, and this has been reported in the Israeli press, in Arez and Idiot Haranot and the magazine 972, but has not been reported in the mainstream press of the United States, which I find fascinating. They've just utterly ignored it. So, yeah, we know what Israel wants, and we know what Israel wants in the West Bank. Increasingly, and I was in Ramallah this summer, increasingly the genocidal tactics that are commonplace in Gaza are now being employed in the West Bank. And the West Bank, for people who don't know it, is contiguous with Jordan, and it includes East Jerusalem, traditionally Arab. And but what they've done is sent colonists into the West Bank, over 700,000 Jewish colonists, many of whom come from other countries. I mean, having spent time in these settlements, Kiryat Arba and others, a huge percentage come from Brooklyn. This is just the distortion, that you have Palestinian families who have lived in a village for literally centuries, and some person, simply because they're Jewish, who grew up in Brooklyn, can fly over and be given a passport and a subsidized villa. So the settlers and the Israeli military, and the settlers have been armed. So this is one of the things they've done since October 7th, is hand out automatic weapons. Everybody has to serve the IDF, so they know how to use them. And they've created these kind of roving death squads, militias that are permitted to terrorize Palestinians. But the most important thing to know about the West Bank is that through closed military zones, one of the most cynical methods they use is creating what they call quote unquote nature preserves, which Palestinians are allowed to enter. Of course, settlements, and you have a road system in the West Bank that only the settlers and the military can use, or the colonists, we should call them colonists.
The tremendous rise of checkposts through the 90s.
Exactly. Well, now, so if you were to drive without checkpoints, so I went into the West Bank over the King Hussein Bridge from Jordan. I was in Jordan this summer working on my Arabic, which is very rusty. I did study Arabic, but my next book will be on Gaza with Joe Sacco. But I need to bring the Arabic back. Joe doesn't speak Arabic. But normally, if you cross over and you were to drive from Jericho to Ramallah, it's a 1 hour drive. But with all of the checkpoints, it can be 3 to 4 hours. And the checkpoints are terrifying for the Palestinians because, first of all, you're trapped there for hours to get through. But then when you hand over your ID, you can just be hauled from the car and disappear. And you have 10,000 Palestinians, many of whom under so-called administrative detention are never charged, including children and women. And that going back to October 7th. So they took those hostages because they wanted to release the thousands of Palestinians who are held. And if the Israeli government wanted to get the hostages back, they could have done it on October 8th. But of course, the hostages became the excuse. Very cynically. Certainly Israel is responsible for a significant number of the deaths of their own citizens. But that's fine in the eyes of Netanyahu because it furthers the primary goal, which is to eradicate the Palestinians from Gaza. And then you have, going back to the West Bank, you have roughly 8 areas with Palestinians that are completely surrounded. And at a moment's notice, you can choke off all travel. Now, a significant number, I forget the exact number, I think it was about 130,000 Palestinians were able, before October 7th, they had work permits. That's all been stopped. Not only the cost of living and fuel prices are extremely high in the West Bank. Not only is the cost of living very high, but now you're seeing, real severe impoverishment especially in places like the Jenin refugee camp, which is a center of resistance.
But there is an infighting going on now between the PA
the colonial police force. Well, you had that in India, with most of them Sikhs or something. Sure,
the martial class.
Yeah. So you, you create this colonial police force, which is what the PA is, and this is just one of the most tragic, elements of this conflict, and they have been going into Jenin and attacking resistance groups on behalf of the Israelis and the CIA. Let's be clear, the CIA is up to their neck in this stuff, both in Gaza and in the West Bank.
And recent surge of disease at Alaska, which is now being reported.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, taking a step back, given what you have just described, how does one look at October 7 itself? Of course, it was done out of helplessness. They exhausted all possible ways in a way. They tried diplomacy, international law, nonviolent resistance during the right of return. Yes. And so it is definitely an equivalent to Ned Turner's rebellion.
I think so, yeah.
But then the next question that comes is that moral questions are also strategic questions. And given the counter-revolution, the counter-strike, if you like. Now, I'm aware of the short term and the long term we are thinking about. Because if one is to take a judgment call about the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1840s, one could easily come to a conclusion that this was a stupid act. But then after 1861, some people would probably make that part of the overall history of dismantling slavery. What's your assessment of the strategic calculation behind what the Hamas fighters did?
Well, I think the strategic calculation was we would take hostages. We would burst through they were far more successful than they thought they were going to be, clearly, which is what led to the chaos, because once you open the holes in the fence, anybody poured over with a gun. So they clearly lost control. But the goal, I don't think that they anticipated the wholesale decimation of Gaza, I'm guessing. I knew two of the Hamas leaders pretty well. Dr. Abdul Aziz Rantisi, the co-founder of Hamas, who was Sheikh Yassin, I knew him. And then I knew Nizar Rayan. So I had some familiarity with Hamas, and then, of course, on the lower echelon. But I suspect they didn't expect this. Hamas, most of my friends in Gaza don't really like Hamas, when I would be completely honest. And they were frustrated because Hamas disarmed the population. Most Palestinians had an AK-47 when they took power, was in 2007. So when the Israelis attacked, you had many, many people who certainly would have carried out acts of resistance, but they had been disarmed by Hamas. Hamas was able to, at least initially, protect themselves in the tunnels and leave the civilian population exposed. And this was, although they talk about Hamas, this is a war against the Palestinian people. That is the primary objective. Hamas is kind of secondary to that. So, I'm not in Gaza, and that's by intent. The Israelis don't want the foreign media in there to report on what's happening. And of course, and they understand that the Palestinian media is more easily discredited, but also targeted. So, as we mentioned earlier, you have over 200 journalists, media workers who have been assassinated, including 5 very recently in northern Gaza, hit in a vehicle marked press. That's not uncommon, by the way. The Reuters vehicle was attacked by the Israelis. It's now in the kind of damaged vehicle is now in the first floor of the Imperial War Museum in London. And the journalists who were wounded in that attack were later killed by the Israelis, Palestinian journalists. So, I'm not sure that we can say it was a mistake or it wasn't a mistake. I think when you're pushed to that level of desperation, I'm not sure the word is correct. Was Nat Turner's rebellion a mistake? Was John Brown's seizure of Harper's Ferry a mistake? I would say that by the time John Brown seized Harper's Ferry, I think that was 1859, if I remember right around there, the Fugitive Slave Act and other pieces of legislation had essentially made a nonviolent resolution of slavery impossible. And I think the same is true that the Israelis have made it clear that there is no peaceful process by which Palestinians will be granted their rights. The Great March of Return, which you mentioned, this is where people marched peacefully up to the barriers set up by Israel and Gaza, saw people just savagely gunned down. Medics were gunned down, journalists were gunned down, people in wheelchairs were gunned down, children were gunned down. Oftentimes they'll aim for the legs so that they're crippled. So Rashid Khalidi makes a really good point, where he says that if you look closely at the resistance over the 75 years of occupation, the savagery by the Zionists is actually escalated against nonviolent resistance because they know that resonates. That's much harder for them to demonize. And the Great March of Return, I think, was a good example of that. Because it was just appalling in terms of the butchery. And again, the utter indifference on the part of the outside world, and in particular the United States, which arms Israel. The Israelis ran out of munitions months ago and could not sustain this genocide, but for the constant infusion of, at this point, billions, what are we, over $20 billion worth of weapons that, and attack aircraft. I mean, F-35, the most sophisticated attack jets that the United States possesses, against people that don't have an air force, don't have a navy, don't have artillery, don't have command and control units, don't have armored vehicles, don't have any of the, you can't call it a war, it's murder, it's mass murder. Whatever the resistance that Hamas puts up, it's not, you can't call that a war, it's not a war.
I wanted to ask you about Hezbollah, given the last time you came on our show, you were, I think, very right to say that let's not exaggerate Hezbollah's power. This was, I don't remember exactly if it was, I think it was prior to the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon this time. But the exchanges were going on, the missile firings. And a lot of people, I think now, overestimated Hezbollah, partly because of what happened in 2006. My two questions are, do you have any information whether Hamas's decision to do what it did on October 7 was coordinated to at least Hezbollah or probably even Iran? And do you think they might have also overestimated Hezbollah's strength?
That's a question I have to answer only with anecdotal information. My understanding is that Hezbollah did not coordinate, that the Hamas did not coordinate with either Hezbollah or Iran. Remember, they had to plan this thing, they couldn't use phones, they couldn't use even their they had to have almost complete electronic silence. In fact, they used their mobile communications as a form of deception to the Israelis, who they knew were listening. To talk about how they didn't want to ratchet up the conflict and this kind of stuff. But yeah, that's my understanding. But I don't have any direct knowledge of that. Mm-hmm. That is my understanding. It was not coordinated. Well, Hezbollah, like Hamas, the difference between the IDF and Hezbollah or Hamas is that Hezbollah fighters and Hamas fighters are willing to die. The IDF soldiers don't want to die. And in Gaza, they call them the diaper army because they hardly ever get out of their armored vehicles. And so they wear diapers, and then Palestinians will come upon piles of diapers in desolate parts of Gaza where they, change their diapers. And so it reminds me very much of the conflict in Bosnia, which I covered. So the Serbs didn't want to fight either, but the Serbs had all of the old J&A tanks. They'd set up the tanks around Sarajevo as artillery pieces and would just lob 90 millimeter tank shells down in the city, 155 or whatever the Soviet equivalent of 155 howitzers, Katyusha rockets. But after the NATO bombing, the Serbs had no stomach for a fight at all. And I was with Dudakovich's 5th Corps when we were pushing the Serb military back into Serbia. And we were about to take Banja Luka, the unit I was with, the 5th Corps was about to take Banja Luka. And Belgrade, which did not want, a few 100,000, whatever the numbers are, of Bosnian Serb refugees, cut a deal with Washington. And we were bombed by Serb MiGs and the Croatian artillery units, which had been with us, were withdrawn. So we were unable to advance. But I think the same is true with the IDF. So when they get on the ground, they have no stomach for an actual confrontation with small arms units.
And do you still maintain that?
Yeah, that's why they'll use tanks. They don't have to. I mean, so the American Army operates much the same way. They have all of this industrial firepower that they can unleash. I mean, rather than go into a building and hunt down snipers, they'll just use a tow missile and destroy it.
It reminds me of Fallujah and a lot of those in
Fallujah, that's how they killed
Iran.
Saddam Hussein's two sons, Uday and Qusay, they found in a house in Mosul.
Right.
And they fired 10 tow missiles. I think it was 10. I mean, tow missiles are pretty big. I mean, they'll take out a tank. I mean, so, the Israeli army, again, anecdotally, we understand has taken pretty significant casualties in southern Lebanon. So I've heard a number of like 4,000 to 5,000. Now, because distances are very short, people often don't know that we're talking about a very small geographical area. So if you go from southern Lebanon in a helicopter, you can, if somebody's grievously wounded, you can get them to very sophisticated medical care very quickly. So I don't know the number of dead, but apparently the wounds are significant, perhaps life-crippling. Israel keeps all of this secret, of course, along with the number of Israelis that have left the country since October 7th, which again, some people are saying 1 million, but certainly hundreds of thousands. And they tend to be more secular, better educated. So what did Israel's response became what their response always is in southern Lebanon, which is that they just started using the Air Force, the artillery and missiles to blow up everything, including parts of Beirut. That's how they fight. That's how the Americans fight, by the way. There's the very similar kind of tactic. I found it interesting that Israel has not moved very far into southern Lebanon. But yeah, Hezbollah is, none of these, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah has more, ability to inflict damage on Israel than Hamas does, of course. But we're still talking about essentially militias. We're not talking about a modern army with all of the sophisticated weaponry and air power. Air power is key. When I was in the last tank battle, I was with the Marine Corps in the first Gulf War, in the last tank battle, north of Kuwait City that ended the war, and the Iraqi Republican Guard tank divisions which had been stationed in Iraq, came over the border to attack us. And between the Apache helicopters, which are just flying anti-tank machines, and the M1 Abrams, which have a longer range than the T-72, they were just decimated. There was never the equipment that the Iraqis had just was no match for and I was later in Basra and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard, so I got to watch them up close for 8 or 9 days, and they were good. I mean, they'd all fought in the Iran-Iraq War. They knew what they were doing, but it was a matter of the equipment. And if you don't have, and the Iraqis had nothing in the air, so they had nothing to protect their own tanks. Well, the same is true with Hezbollah. The same is true with Hamas. And when you are on the ground in a battlefield like that, as I have been, many times, starting the war in El Salvador, which I covered for 5 years, air power is key. So the way they broke the FMLN in El Salvador was in January of 1984, the Reagan administration started sending down fleets of Huey helicopters. And I used to travel with the FMLN quite a bit, but you couldn't mass in large numbers once you had helicopter fleets up. So before that, you could travel with groups of 800 or 900 fighters. That didn't exist anymore because you were too exposed. Hueys are noisy. That's just anecdotal, but so you can hear them a long way off. And so they brought down these Bell helicopters that you couldn't hear. It was equipped with miniguns, and if you got caught by those, you were finished. So yeah, I mean, we don't want to exaggerate I don't want to take anything away from the courage of both the fighters in Hamas and Hezbollah, which is immense, but we can exaggerate their ability to actually confront. Israel just didn't want to take the losses in 2006 on the ground, and they don't want to take the losses now. So that aspect of low-intensity warfare, that's something the Israelis, like the Americans, they avoid.
Mm-hmm. To talk about the larger, the context of the Palestinian resistance movement, the movement for national liberation in the context of the Arab world, it has been such a downhill. The Palestinian question used to be at the center. Post 1948, it was one of the leading central questions of Arab nationalism. And then through Camp David, Jordan brought into fold in the 90s, and the recent context is even fall of Syria. Not that Bashar al-Assad was intervening in any meaningful ways in supporting the Palestinian resistance, but nevertheless he was a link between Iran and Hezbollah mattered as far as the resistance in Gaza went. How, talking of despair, how isolated Palestine and Palestinians are from the larger Arab world today?
I was in Egypt and had dinner with somebody who'd been a minister in Gamal Abdel Nasser's government. Sadat had thrown him in prison for 10 years. I don't want to say more than that because I don't want to get him in trouble. But he said to me, it's not that Israel's strong, it's that the Arab regimes are weak. And I thought that's it. Because you had the destruction of any regime that was not controlled by the United States and its European allies was targeted and destroyed. Sadat, of course, with the Camp David Accords, sold out the Palestinians by negotiating a separate peace with Israel. It got the occupied areas of the Sinai back, but it completely sold out the Palestinians. And then what you saw is Egypt, which has always been, a pivotal player in the Middle East, it's the Arab world's most populous country, become isolated. Sadat was eventually assassinated. And then you have the King Abdullah. So, when I was in Jordan this summer, there were street protests and in front of the Israeli embassy, which the Israelis have evacuated. It's empty. And people would chant, "We are all Hamas," but they would also chant against Abdullah. And so the Saudi regime, the Egyptian Sisi, they're very fragile. There's no public protest allowed in Egypt at all, because these rulers know how swiftly those protests can morph from support for the Palestinians to opposition to the regimes that have betrayed them. So the reason Israel pushed so hard for the U.S. to invade Iraq, and why they're pushing for the U.S. to not invade, but probably carry out a sustained bombing campaign in Iran, is that they saw Saddam as, correctly, as a regional power that was hostile. And so they've broken the Arab regimes. And these Arab regimes are, they call themselves kings, but come on, they're dictators. They're very unpopular, they're very corrupt, and the only constraint is that the mood on the street, especially with the genocide, is one of real rage as to what's happening to fellow Arabs. But the regimes themselves are complicit. So when I was in Jordan, the only Arab country that has acted with any, well, I'll use the word integrity, is Yemen.
Of course.
When history is written, the only regime that has attempted to stop the genocide is Yemen. And with the disruption of maritime traffic, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan set up a land bridge. And I know because I saw, lines and lines of trucks going through the King Hussein Bridge on into Israel. And they were bringing, any consumer goods. There were trucks with fans, there were trucks with vegetables, anything. And the great Palestinian journalist, and whose name escapes me at the moment, she, in a Lebanese publication, wrote an article that named the firms that in Jordan that were complicit, and she's sitting in prison. She's got a 1-year prison sentence for that. She also wrote an article condemning the complicity of the Jordanian military in shooting down the drones or whatever they were, missiles that were sent from Iran to very specifically targeted military installations, including the Mossad headquarters in Israel. So the reverberations of this, which the Arab regimes understand, is potentially seismic as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Do you make any distinction between the traditional Arab states that were part of Arab nationalism insofar as the Palestinian question was concerned, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and those that rose later and became Western allies, mostly the Gulf monarchs?
Well, the monarchs preceded the Atheists.
Mm-hmm.
The lobbies, that all preceded.
Yeah, but they were not part of the Arab nationalism as that.
No, they never were.
Nasserite Republican.
No, they weren't, and they hated them.
So, today speaking, is there any distinction between, let's say, Egypt and Jordan and those that are part of the Abrahamic Accord?
No, not anymore. There used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan was always a kind of strange phenomenon in that the Hashemites are Saudi; they're not Jordanian at all.
Mm-hmm.
So Jordan has always been a client state. It was physically created and sustained and funded, especially by the British, but also by the Americans. That's always been Jordan. Whereas in Egypt, you had Gamal Abdel Nasser. I would say that the change is not so much the destruction of Arab nationalism, and Bashar al-Assad was a Ba'athist.
Mm-hmm.
He was probably the last, right? There's no more Ba'athist regime now. But they, like Saddam Hussein, who was a Ba'athist, they corrupted. They were secular in that sense. I worked in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was there, and you had a thriving middle class, and you had women could be doctors, and they had a very fine educational system. They had very fine infrastructure, including hospitals, all of which the Americans destroyed.
Were they in the 70s or 90s?
No, I was in the Middle East from 88 to 95,
Mm-hmm.
but then I covered the war in Bosnia and Kosovo. But then I would be sent, because I speak Arabic, the New York Times would just send me back for months at a time. So
Mm-hmm.
until the early 2000s, I was working there pretty frequently.
Mm-hmm. I was just curious because Patrick Cockburn wrote about Saddam Hussein, and he said he inherited a much more functional Iraqi society that had, as you said, doctors. But he wanted to become famous. But by the time he was gone, there was very little left. And he was not blaming Saddam for everything. The vicious sanctions from 91 to 2000.
Yeah, sure. That's right. The sanctions was put under the Clinton administration, so you had horrific sanctions imposed, including on medicine. And so you had this macabre scenes in hospitals where, children couldn't get cancer treatment and were dying. And I think 1 million Iraqis died because of those sanctions, and half of them were children. So, of course, and then after the first Gulf War, the sanctions were really onerous, and I was in Iraq then. So Saddam, he couldn't even get parts for his tanks, everything was falling apart. And this is what made the invasion of Iraq so criminal, in the sense that Iraq was not only did it not have weapons of mass destruction, but it was not a threat to its neighbors, much less to the United States or anyone else. But it was a Zionist project, and the project was to destroy Iraq, which they succeeded. Iraq was broken up into Kurdish and enclaves, kind of quasi-independent Kurdish state, which also, they established Kurdish militias in the north of Syria to where the oil fields are. What a surprise. 900. Well, we don't know, actually. They used to say 900 U.S. troops were based there. And then somebody leaked out that it's more like a couple thousand. Nevertheless.
In northeast Syria.
Yeah, north and east. So, but the Ba'athist regimes became. I worked in Syria under Hafiz al-Assad. I was thrown out of Syria, and I was blacklisted. I was never allowed to get back in. You didn't have to report much to get banned from Syria. So they weren't Nasser. But I think, to go back to the Baathists and the nationalists, the difference is not the Ba'athist regime in the Middle East. The difference is the non-aligned movement. So you had Nehru, Nasser, and Tito. I worked in all those countries, including India. But that was a force to be reckoned with. And I think that if you had those figures and you had the power of the non-aligned movement, it would be much harder for Israel to carry out the genocide. So the opposition would not necessarily have come from Ba'athist or from Arab nationalist regimes, but from that coalition, which, well, you probably know and I don't, whose idea was the non-aligned movement? Was it Nehru's idea? I don't know whose idea it was. Maybe it was Tito's idea.
Probably, yeah.
They were all really interesting figures, really, all three of them.
I think there was a Bandung conference in Indonesia, which was really pivotal.
I seem to remember that Tito was the driving force behind it, because, of course, he was having his difficulties with Stalin.
Okay.
So...
Yeah, but there was also a preceding context, because for a lot of people in the global South, during the Second World War and within that polarizing world, a key question was, which sides do you take? Are the Nazis worse or the traditional colonial powers worse? And so a third way came out of that very logically, and I think that also created that space for non-alignment.
Yeah. Yes, and you had 1 million troops in the Indian Army who fought in the Second World War.
Right.
But of course they wanted something for it. And there was this, even within the Soviet Union, Stalin stopped talking about Marxism and reopened the churches. It was about the fatherland. And there was, hope that things would change in many of these countries after the Second World War. Great Britain also lost its power. The power had really broken in the First World War, and then there was just a slow decline of empire, which really culminated with the Second World War, so that it wasn't able to really hold on to its colonies. That's a good question. If you're an Indian or if you're a Kenyan, who's worse? I'm sorry, the British are worse. If you're from modern day Namibia, well, yeah, the Germans are I mean, genocide is not country specific. I mean, this is one of the problems I have with people who talk about the Holocaust as being unique. Well, every genocide is unique in a sense in terms of how it operates and its tactics.
Within that.
Yeah, but it's still genocide. And if, a genocide is, I mean, how many people died in the Indian famine? What do you know?
The Bengal famine.
Yeah, 3 million? Was it 3 million?
Yeah.
3 million people.
Yeah, so much about 6 million Jews, but no one knows about 3 million Indians that died.
And let's be clear, they died because of British railroads and because they destroyed the traditional village system because they knew with El Nino and everything else, the cycle of declining crop yields, and they trucked all the grain out.
Right.
And left them to die. And where did they truck? Where did they send it?
A lot of allied armies arrived who needed grains. I wanted to ask you a little bit about recent developments in Syria. And I think a key question that divides people now is the assessment of Assad. Because I think I would be curious to know your overall assessment of Assad, because that is linked to how one looks at the fall of Assad government.
So, I mean, I get into this discussion over not just Syria, but Nicaragua and Ortega. The fact that forces like the CIA in the United States are trying to destroy, or were trying to destroy the Assad regime and are trying to destroy the Nicaraguan regime under Ortega, doesn't mean that these people, hold up a flag for anti-imperial goodness. It's not mutually exclusive. I mean, they can also be bastards too. And
Assad supported bombing and invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, well, and I believe didn't the United States set up black sites for torture in Syria?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The Syrians were good at it. They picked out, the most, brutal allies they had and shipped off these poor Afghans to disappear in many cases. So, yeah, it was a brutal, corrupt regime, but it was not controlled by the United States in particular and Western forces. It did provide a conduit between Iran and Hezbollah. You had heavy Russian presence, including, of course, Russian bases. And this all angered, in particular, the United States and Israel, which is why they backed Jolani and overthrew him. Now, remember, this was a long process. I mean, the sanctions were crippling. You had, before Assad fell, you were lucky to get 1 hour of electricity a day in Damascus. There was no work. The food prices were it's clear that when Assad wasn't wrong in assuming that both the peaceful opposition, after 2011, but then also the armed opposition were backed by people who were his mortal enemies. Mm-hmm. That's true. And by the end, because they had seized the oil fields, and they'd also seized, they had most of the rich agricultural land was occupied. Yeah. So the Syrians had really no way to sustain their economy at all. They were heavily dependent on Russia. My understanding is that...
and also some of those industrial sector on the north and the west that were controlled by Turkey.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Turks are a wild card right now because they want those Kurds out. I don't know how that's going to play out. Erdogan's a strange megalomaniac. I don't know. So,
what would be the U.S. response to escalating Turkey's rhetoric against the PKK and the Kurdish movement? Because the Kurds are the traditional, all-weather allies of the United States. I'm drawing on from Iraq itself.
Yeah, but the Kurds, throughout their history, have allies, including the United States, who constantly betray them. So, I don't know. I mean, I think that having worked in Turkey, I think the Turks are adamant about removing the Kurdish forces from the north. I think that's not negotiable. On the other hand, clearly they have U.S. support and they have, I believe, Israeli support. The Israelis have long supported the Kurds clandestinely, always. I mean, when I worked a lot in northern Iraq and the Kurdish areas, and the Israelis were a shadowy but significant presence there. So I don't know. That's the wild card. It could get really messy.
I was curious because even in Iraq, the Sunni resistance that began soon after the occupation, and then gradually the Shia resistance. There was civil war between the Sunnis and the Shias, but there was also many Shias that participated against occupation, who were nationalists in a way.
Yeah.
But the Kurds were, by and large, they never opposed the occupation.
No, because they saw it as a way to create an independent Kurdish state, which they weren't wrong. I mean, that's essentially what's happened. It's not a de facto, it's a de facto state. It's not an actual state. So, and then the only way the Americans could finally get rid of ISIS was through Kurdish militias. And so then you now have these Kurdish forces. And Turkey claims that they're PKK, but that's, who knows? I mean, for the Turks, any Kurd is a member of the PKK. This is the separatist groups in Turkey. I mean, there are, I think, 40 or 50,000 ISIS prisoners the Kurds have. So, I mean, what happens if they open those cells? I don't know. I mean, it's not going to be clean and easy. And like all of this stuff, once you employ this kind of violence to, radically disrupt the status quo and create social engineering, it has a kind of ripple effect. And initially, there's a quiescence to it, as there was, after the U.S. invaded Iraq. But that's not going to last. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know.
You mentioned Russia's presence into the Mediterranean through the air base at Al-Khamim and naval base at Tartus. I wanted to ask you about Russia itself, given there are reports about massive escalation. President Biden, as he went out, green signaled use of long-range ballistic missiles deeper into territories of Russia, and also which they used, and also use of personal landmines. And the Russian response was, Russia's foreign minister said that we see this as a new phase of the war, and there was a revision of its nuclear doctrine, whose threshold was lowered down. How do you make sense of this last moment, completely irrational decision?
Well, it's driven by these neocon ideologues who, for decades, I mean, going back, all the way to the contra-war Nicaragua, have a death grip on U.S. foreign policy and see the world solely through the eyes of confrontation and the belief that violence is the tool by which America will reestablish hegemony, which, by the way, is the demented vision of all dying empires. So when I was covering the war in Salvador, Nicaragua, you had Robert Kagan, was working for Elliott Abrams, neither of whom knew anything about Latin America, zero, and they're still with us. These are the people who pushed for the war in Iraq. Biden has long been in their camp. Biden called for the invasion of Iraq 5 years before we invaded Iraq. And they have just created fiasco after fiasco. We don't have to list them, but Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, because we were going to arm quote unquote moderate rebels. Then when we found that every ISIS and Al Qaeda militant had recognized that Syria was where you go to get weapons, we started bombing the very people we'd armed. Just catastrophic. They never get held to account. All of these generals, all of these neocons, so they're the ones who are pushing, this kind of confrontation with Russia. They're the ones I was actually in Eastern and Central Europe in 1989. I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall and was in Czechoslovakia every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel, and then was in Romania. So I was there when the promises were made to Gorbachev, because they could not reunite Germany without the acquiescence of the Soviet Union. And there was a promise made by the then Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker, I was in the room, that they would not expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. Well, they violated that promise almost immediately. Why? One, because with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you got this rhetoric, again, from these insane neocons about a unipolar world. We rule the world. There's no power now that can disrupt American hegemony, which was fantasy. And the other was billions in arms sales, because countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary, they had to reconfigure their military to be NATO compatible with NATO equipment. And that has been a huge bonanza. So it was a mixture of hubris and greed. There was no secret that this would trigger the incorporation of Ukraine into NATO. This would trigger a response from Russia. WikiLeaks published cables by William Burns, now head of the CIA, but he was the ambassador to Russia, who said that across political lines, that's a red line that you don't want to cross. It doesn't matter whether you're for Putin or against Putin, it doesn't make any difference. Well, so they knew what the response would be, which I don't think excuses what Putin did. But he was baited, and he took the bait. And now you're seeing, the whole thing was very cynical from the beginning. We talked about air power. Ukraine virtually doesn't have any air power. So they were giving them like M1 Abrams tanks, which are very temperamental. It takes a long time to operate an M1 Abrams, and if you make a mistake, it can be lethal. Knowing full well they would just get, it was not going to any way improve the military situation in Ukraine. But the goal of the war, for the United States, was to degrade the Russian military and let Ukraine be destroyed, and Ukrainians bleed to death to do it, and isolate Putin in Europe, which they did. But of course, it backfired in the sense that it thrust Putin into the arms of China. China technologically advanced, Putin rich in natural resources, and upended the whole mantra of the Cold War, which was keep Beijing and Moscow apart. That was the primary goal of the Cold War.
The Nixon strategy.
Yes, Nixon-Kissinger strategy. So that's that's what's happening. That they believe that there will be a confrontation with Russia. They believe that this is inevitable, as with China. And so they will carry out these provocations, which becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. But they're really lunatics. I've interviewed some of them. They're just lunatics. But they're funded by the war industry. So they have all these think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, and there's several others, and they never go away because they act as shills for the war industry. But yeah, they don't know. They've created just disaster after disaster after disaster, and they're going to keep doing it.
Mm-hmm. What surprises me sometimes about the same hawkish response to Russia as it is with China is that in the case of China, at least one can lay out a rational, even though unjustified, argument about confrontation if your vision is about a world where you'd like to see American hegemony, because you can talk about their rise of economy, their rise in technology, creating their ability to creating completely new systems, whether it's the payment system, whether it's social media networks and so on, while Russia has none of that. Russian economy is not even comparable, and I mean any segment of society you can imagine, Russia falls behind.
Yeah.
And still you have this idea that there is this big, massive confrontation with Russia that has to be done if Western civilization has to be protected.
Well, because these people have never gotten over the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they're grounded in. And it's this Manichaean view of the world, of black and white, good and evil. I mean, the irony is that, Putin he hates communism. I mean, he's a dictator who embraces the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, it's almost a czar, really. But that they don't. There's no nuance. These people don't have any. I mean, I covered the war in Nicaragua, and the Reagan administration was funding the Contras, who were all these former National Guard killers from Somoza. Nicaragua was a dirt poor agrarian country with 3 million people.
Mm-hmm.
Or it doesn't pose a threat to but they can't see it. I mean, they're totally self-deluded. And what's frightening to people like us is we can't get rid of them. It doesn't matter how many times they mess up. It doesn't matter how many people they're responsible for. I mean, that's Jimmy Carter just died. I mean, Jimmy Carter under Brzezinski, who was a nut. I mean, and
was one of the architect for the confrontation with Russia.
Yeah, well, because he was a Pole. He was an exiled Pole, and his whole world was about destroying Russia or anybody who he thought was allied with the Soviet Union, not Russia, the Soviet Union, or even sympathetic. And that's he oversaw the debacle in Afghanistan. They actively destabilized the government in Kabul, which was Soviet backed, and then created the Taliban, which created Al Qaeda. And we're still living with the repercussions of that disaster. 1.5 million Afghans died. I think the U.S. spent $3 billion. I don't know how many billions the Saudis spent to build Wahhabi schools. Talib is the Arabic word for student. So that's where the Taliban gets its name. They spread Wahhabism, this kind of fundamentalist form of Islam, all over Pakistan, this was all done again by these dedicated cold warriors who are just unable to see nuance. I mean, I worked in Eastern and Central Europe. The idea that communism was monolithic is ridiculous. The idea that the Arab world is monolithic. I mean, I dealt with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda condemned Hamas as apostates because Al Qaeda was supranational. It was kind of nihilistic in that it didn't believe, like the Jamaat Islamiyah in Egypt or other places, there wasn't a nationalist movement. It had deep confrontation. But you have to understand all of these nuances if you're going to operate effectively in any part of the world. And these people don't. They're utterly clueless. I mean, they're kind of idiots, to be honest. But because they further this policy of, in essence, endless war. And because endless war makes the weapons manufacturers, we don't make much else in the United States, by the way, or weapons, very, very rich. They never go away. I mean, they are on the cable news networks and, brought in as policy advisors. And
there was this recent article in Bloomberg that wrote that the new age of dominance is pivoted or centered around these three words: bits, bots, and bullets. By bits, they mean the crypto, the bots is artificial intelligence, and the bullets is military power. And they said these are the three things where the US is doing exceedingly well, meaning saying that not everything is over, right? A lot of naysayers say.
That's a perfect example of how they reduce complex thought to mindless cliches. And you know what? They speak and think in mindless cliches. And that's it.
I wanted to quickly ask you, which I did even during our last interview, but since a lot of people liked it, your debate with the new atheists. You have written against religious fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism particularly, but if one follows you, one sees through your condemnation of suicide bombing and Islamic fundamentalism. But you also took on the stalwarts, if you like, of the new atheist movement. What was this whole buzz about new atheists?
Well, because they're secular fundamentalists.
Mm-hmm.
Chomsky said they're fanatics for the state religion. That's right. I mean, they just changed the vocabulary. So Muslims aren't satanic the way the Christian right brand them as. They're barbarians. They totally buy into the myth of Western virtue, Western civilization. And I didn't pay much attention to them. I'm not a very orthodox Christian until I had to debate Sam Harris at UCLA, and then I debated Christopher Hitchens at Berkeley. So I hadn't read their books. I had to read them to debate them. And I couldn't believe it. It was just dribble. It was intellectually vapid. I mean, they didn't know what they were talking about, especially when they wrote about the Muslim world. They didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know the Bible. They didn't know. I mean, it would be the equivalent of me trying to write a book on biology, given my very limited exposure to biology in high school. I mean, that's kind of where they were. Mm-hmm. So the only thing they could attack was...
And probably even worse, because I think like with the dominance of science, one has to admit one's ignorance. But when it comes from neurology or whatever, you kind of assume that there's nothing to understand in sociology. Yeah. So it's kind of worse than the analogy that you offered.
Yeah. Well, they what they do is they set up a caricature of religion and attack it. So I don't believe in hell or heaven or angels, or I'm not, even particularly interested in the historical Jesus or any of that. But they can't step outside of the box that they've created. And they seduced a lot of kids, a lot of young people. I wrote a book which was called, the hardback was called I Don't Believe in Atheists. And then the paperback, the publisher changed the name to When an Atheism Becomes a Religion. It's not long, but it came out of those debates, not of reading their works, in the sense that they really replicate the shallow ideology of the very fundamentalists they attack. They're the mirror image of those fundamentalists.
What do you think is the role of religion in modern day politics? I am asking this given, of course, the overall context of Islamophobia, which is particularly perverse in India, but also within the left tradition, which for a moment thought that religion and supernatural beliefs, if you like, are inconsistent with the idea of a modernizing, progressive world. It didn't go too far. I mean, that project is partly still alive in China, if you like, but with the reform and opening through tourism and, and some of those orthodoxy of the Maoist areas, being drawn down, those attacks have vaporized. I mean, there have been some occasions. So I'm wondering, like, given your religious background and given your interest in progressive world and politics, how do you look at the intersection of
So
the two?
Pankaj Mishra wrote a good book, The Age of Anger, where he talked about the essentially loss of traditional belief and the alienation within secular society and the consequences of that. So it was Nietzsche who wrote that the death of God would foster religious fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalism is magical thinking. And magical thinking is what you do when you're desperate or in despair. And that characterizes the Christian right. It characterizes Hindu fundamentalism. It characterizes Islamic fundamentalism. I mean, there are many common tenets to fundamentalism, regardless of which religious tradition it comes out of. And the most important one is that it externalizes evil. So evil becomes embodied in the other. And when we eradicate the other, we will eradicate evil. This is really dangerous. And it's also,
rather than being self-reflecting.
Right. So even in the Quran, which a lot of people don't know, the Prophet speaks about the various forms of jihad. And he says the most difficult form of jihad is the purging of the evil within us. That's certainly true within the whole concept of sin, within the Christian tradition. So fundamentalists, they externalize evil. They believe that the eradication of those who embody evil by violence is a way to purge the world, cleanse the world. And it doesn't really matter. And so when I went after the new atheists, they totally externalize evil and believe in the power of violence to cleanse the world. I would say that is the core of all fundamentalist belief, regardless of the religious tradition. I think the left lost. Let's talk about the European left, because I don't know the left in the global south. But the left in the industrialized countries lost their way when they severed themselves from religious belief. Remember, our two greatest prophets, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, were deeply religious. The abolitionists were deeply religious. Even Eugene V. Debs, our great socialist, he spent far more time quoting the Bible than he did Marx. And in my own personal, belief system, the power of a religious belief is that we're not bound to what we can achieve empirically. In fact, of course, everything I've spent my life fighting for is worse, everything. But it doesn't invalidate what I did, because you are taught not to measure your life by what you achieve, but by what you stand for. And because you are taught that when you truly stand with the oppressed, those the theologian James Cone called the crucified of the earth, you'll be treated like the oppressed. I mean, I've been completely blacklisted, especially around the genocide. I gave a talk at University of California, Santa Barbara a few weeks ago, and the administration banned all publicity about the talk, including from the department that had invited me. So I got to, a 500-seat auditorium, and there were like 24 people. It's as if I was never there. I mean, they filmed it, they put it up on YouTube, and even with all the algorithms, it got 150,000 views. But that's I mean, ever since this fall, there's been a powerful effort to silence us. You've seen it in particular on the university campuses, where it's not just that encampments are banned, but any kind of, even going into the Widener Library at Harvard in a silent protest, but you're banned from the library. You can't flyer, you can't. The handful of faculty have been, Ruha Benjamin at Princeton is great. And certainly, I think, one of the most renowned professors is on probation for standing up for Palestinian rights. The students who occupy the buildings in particular are all not only on probation, but have been warned that if they do anything else, they're out. That, I think when you come out of a religious tradition, you're not bound to the temporal in the sense that even if everything you achieve is a failure, you are beholden to, let's call it moral law. And your fealty to moral law is what you use to define what we would call success or a life of meaning. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, and I think people, the Buddhists say that you can memorize as many sutras as you want, it won't make you wise. Mm-hmm. And that religion, like art, is an attempt to grapple, often imperfectly, with those non-rational, I don't say irrational, but non-rational elements, grief, beauty, our own mortality, a search for meaning, love. I mean, Freud said I can write about sex. It's very difficult to write about love. And that those elements do go into making a complete life. And for me, the great philosophical and theological writers grapple with those issues. Mm-hmm. And that's how I'm trained. I mean, I went to divinity school, but more than that, my father was a minister and my mother, a seminary graduate, was a professor. So I grew up like that. Mm-hmm. And I've not deviated much from it. I mean, it was a very leftist religiosity, mm-hmm. what we call the social gospel, which certainly probably doesn't exist too much anymore. But it was the belief that, as Martin Buber, the theologian, writes, in his book, I and Thou, it's not about us. It's about our neighbor. It's about those who suffer. And that faith is defined by our ability to confront injustice, or more importantly, radical evil. Mm-hmm. And that when you truly confront radical evil will seek to destroy you, and often destroy you. Mm-hmm. And it's that understanding that, for me anyway, gives me a kind of foundation or stolidity, where, if I spent 14 years fighting, along with other people, for the release of Julian Assange. I didn't think they were going to let him out, but it didn't stop me, because I was certainly the most important journalist of our generation. There's right. There's no doubt about that. But because we had to. I fight for the Palestinians, and have for years, even though that has been detrimental to my own career. Quite detrimental to my mm-hmm. own career. But that doesn't matter. What matters is my ability to go back to Palestine and look my Palestinian friends in the eyes and say, I didn't betray them. Mm-hmm. I didn't betray them. And anyway, whatever cost I pay is nothing compared to what they pay anyway.
I like what you said about the non-rational world, not irrational, but things like love, hope, excitement. And I've often felt very strongly that probably the rational world is might be even more limited in terms of scale than the non-rational world. We feel sympathy, we feel anger, emotions, love, all the time. We do mathematical calculations when we're dealing with money or building a house and things like that. I often think though whether that's something very essential element of our species, or whether that's something that has to do with religion, because yes, religion is one subset that deals with all these non-rational elements. I'm still curious, do you think they are essential? They're essential elements of understanding the non-rational world.
You mean religion?
Yeah. Because for instance, I find it hard to relate with religion, given my background, given the caste system in India, and there I also feel as I listen to you about the relationship between the left and the radical traditions and religion, I felt instinctively this is not based on research. I think the trajectory in the Americas in particular, both Latin America and also North America, might be slightly different from that in Asia, where the left had really confronted religion, whether for good or bad reasons. That's the jury is out. But yeah, my question was to understand those non-rational world. Yes, some people use religion, or some people do it through religion. Do you think if others don't relate to religion, they can arrive at the same relationship with those?
Yes, of course. So Camus would be a good example.
Mm-hmm.
I think, artists do, because ultimately it's about empathy. It's the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other.
Mm-hmm.
I, grew up in a religious household. My father was a civil rights activist. He was an anti-war activist. He fought in World War II. And also a gay rights activist, for which the church was very unforgiving. My uncle was gay. So my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 50s and 60s. Was very loved, very close to his brother. So that's the tradition I came out of. That's the vocabulary. I do think religion gives you a kind of vocabulary,
mm-hmm.
which I don't find anywhere else, in terms of forgiveness, redemption, penance, all of that stuff. But I think that we don't want to confuse institutional religion with
Absolutely.
the religious impulse, because institutional religion is, one bloody repressive, over the centuries. And every war that I covered, the Serbian Orthodox Church was blessing the Serbian fighters in Bosnia who were carrying out the genocide. The Catholics in Croatia were doing the same in their attacks, and the Croat attacks against the Serbs. Religious institutions have an appalling history, and usually sacralize, especially in times of conflict, violence.
Mm-hmm.
So the theologian Paul Tillich said all institutions, including the church, are inherently demonic. I think that's correct. And my father ran afoul of the institution he served. They pushed him out of the church, especially on the gay issue. Martin Luther King was abandoned by even the black church. People forget there was tremendous hostility towards King within the black church, but he was, at the end of his life, really abandoned by everyone. Malcolm was completely alone at the end. I don't think we want to confuse. In the 3rd century is when the Christian institutional church under Constantine was created.
Right.
And it was created to essentially sanctify conquest and war and power. But yeah, we want to draw a sharp distinction. Right. And those people that I consider important religious figures are always in conflict with the institution that they come out of. And often those institutions turn on them quite viciously.
From Jesus in Palestine to the Jesuit priests in Latin America.
Yeah.
I want to quickly ask you about the prison system because I read 2 books on Indian prison system. And the first thing I realized, of course, the Indian prison system is not as extensive as the US prison system in terms of scale, divided by total population. So we don't have as many per capita incarcerated people. Maybe we don't need it because it's an open air prison, not to take anything away from Gaza, but the destitution and poverty and misery out there in the streets. Sometimes people actually want to go to prison because you get meals there.
Well, I once took the train from Delhi up to, I think it was Amritsar, or maybe it was Chandigarh. So I didn't understand the depth of poverty in India till I took that train ride and saw the mile after mile after mile. And I thought, oh, wow. It's like people living in total destitution on either side of the tracks for miles and miles and miles.
Coming back to my question, I read those 2 books, and what I realized is that the prison system is a system that is completely invisibilized from citizens. There is nothing that we are taught about the prison system or the prison, but the whole world of prison in our schools. It's a taboo. It's highly invisible. For our viewers and for me as well, I want to know, through your teaching years in the prison system, is it the New Jersey prison system? What do you think you saw and learned that you think you wouldn't have learned if you didn't go there?
It delineated the caste system in the United States because most of the people in prison are poor and of color, and they never had access to any kind of adequate legal defense. But more importantly, they never had an opportunity for an education, for any kind of economic stability, any kind of advancement, and many of them were forced into the illegal economy, which is usually drugs, to survive. And the code of the illegal economy, which is violent, both in terms of the oppressive apparatus of our militarized police, but also among people who compete on the streets, requires that you carry a weapon. Most of the people that I taught who carried weapons, they didn't carry a weapon they carried a weapon for other people who were trying to steal their money and their drugs. Everything conspired. Redlining, which means they couldn't get loans, probation services, police, dysfunctional schools, the breakdown of families, especially with the men in prison. Everything conspired to keep the poor poor. There was just no way out. That was, I had lived across the street from a housing project in Roxbury in Boston when I was in divinity school. So I'd seen that. I'd run a small church there. I think the other thing is the dysfunction of the court system in the United States, because 94% of people in prison are forced to plea out. They're coerced into pleading out. How does that work? If people actually went to jury trial, which is their right, the system would collapse. It's not built. They don't have the ability to carry out jury trials. So when you're arrested, they will stack all sorts of charges on you that the police and the prosecutor knows are untrue. Kidnapping, for instance, is a big one because that's 25 years. Then they go to you, or they go to your public defense attorney who, is overwhelmed. They don't have any ability to focus on your case, and they bargain. They say, okay, we'll take off this charge and that charge, and you'll get 9 years or whatever. If you go to trial, all those charges remain. And so the students in the prison that I teach, and they earn their college degree through Rutgers University, the students that I teach with the longest sentences are the ones who, number one, are usually innocent because they actually So they go, I didn't do it. I'm not. And they go to trial, but all those charges remain. And the charges they can get are insane. I mean, it's like life plus 154 years, which is a death sentence.
Sure.
So the numbers of people who I suspect are innocent is pretty high, 25% at least. The savagery of the system itself, I mean, all vocational programs are essentially have been stripped away within the prison. So this program through Rutgers, it's privately funded. It's not, they raise the money to do it. And the talent. I mean, I have taught classes in there. I've had students in there. I mean, some of whom have graduated summa cum laude from Rutgers. To imagine, it's hard enough to do when you're a student. Imagine that doing it in a prison cell. Just the thirst. I mean, so the students I teach, they're a self-selected group, but they've turned their cells into libraries. They are real intellectuals. So this harkens back to Gramsci's idea of the organic intellectual. Well, of course, the society does not want the underclass to be educated. They don't want to create intellectuals out of the underclass who remain loyal to the underclass, which you have to do with a felony conviction anyway, because when you get out, you can't get a job. I went as a scholarship student to a very fancy private boarding school where King Abdullah's two sons went. And I think there were only 16 of us on scholarship. Well, most of the scholarship kids were desperate to become part of the 1%. That's why they were given a scholarship. We're giving you the golden ticket. Mm-hmm. And so these elite institutions will allow a small number of academically gifted in, knowing full well that they'll be acculturated into, because they don't come from any money, being acculturated into that ruling class. And while you're there, you're acculturated into the ruling class. Mm-hmm. And so my students are dangerous. They can, well, first of all, they're usually black or brown. They can never be acculturated into the ruling class because of who they are, because of where they come from, and because of their records. And yet they're serious. Some of them are really serious intellectuals, and they are dangerous. And it's oppressive regimes, colonial regimes, they always seek to prevent the oppressed. Mm-hmm. Because, I tell my students, when you understand how power works, I always give them a book by a sociologist called The Captive Society, which is, he went into the prison system and wrote about how power works in a prison. And the layers, those people who collaborate and how they collaborate and why. Once you understand how power works, whether it's in a prison or anywhere else, you become dangerous because It's a lot harder for power to play you. But you've got to be taught. I mean, so if you go to Harvard Business School, or you're going to be taught how to use power, how power works on your behalf and on behalf of your class. But those are the kinds of things you don't want to teach to people in a prison, mm-hmm. and which is why I do it. I mean, every class I teach is the same. It's called Revolt. I mean, I taught a class. It was called a history class. It was called Conquest. We read Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, which is on the Haitian liberation, the only successful slave revolt in human history, which Haiti's been paying for ever since. And I was speaking at the University of Montana, so I gave the class a syllabus. I said, I won't be here this week because I'm speaking at the University of Montana. I got a phone call, and they said, this is the Special Investigations Division of the Department of Corrections of the state of New Jersey. Are you aware that your students just led a sit-down strike in prison? They got it.
I want to quickly ask you a couple more questions.
Sure.
On media, last time you were on our show, you made this very important point that the alternative media, all the small platforms on YouTube and elsewhere, their limitation is the resource limitation, for which they cannot collect data, they cannot create, they cannot pump it too much. Nevertheless, they provide good analysis. I was thinking about the genocide in Gaza and the role played by the progressive alternative media in discrediting the New York Times and their likes. I meet a lot of people today who doesn't take the Times narrative seriously anymore. My question is, do you see there is a hope about alternative media, the non-corporate sector, and if there is a hope, what kind of things this alternative space can do?
Well, it's not an alternative space because we're chained to their platforms. Google, YouTube, Meta. I mean, they're all fused with the national security state, as Matt Taibbi pointed out in the Twitter files. So Julian Assange wrote a book called Cypherpunks a few years ago, which was pretty smart. And he said, in the short term, this space gives us independence and an alternative. In the long term, it is an incredible tool for totalitarian control. And as you're right, I mean, the ratings are cratering at MSNBC, CNN, and Times, because they've been exposed. But the worse that gets, the more draconian the control and the censorship becomes. So, I mean, I was thrown off of the Real News. I've been thrown off a lot of platforms, but that's the latest one. I mean, when they shut down RT, where I had a show for 6 years, YouTube erased my entire 6-year archive. Just erased it in an instant. It's gone. The Real News, their big donor, is a Biden supporter, and I was calling Biden out for the genocide. I did a show with Dennis Kucinich, who's hardly a flaming radical. I mean, I love Dennis. And they took the show down and canceled the show. So I set up my own program, as you have done. And then because it's become, then I've got to pay a staff and all that kind of stuff. What does YouTube do? They demonetize me. And the AI does it, so it's instant. Doesn't matter what I do. Because what they want to do is starve the funds, even though they still run ads on it, which is really sleazy. So, and then you've got all the shadow banning and everything else, which is all happening. So the Achilles heel here is that we're dependent on the very corporate institutions we're attacking. And they're the worse things get, the less tolerance there'll be for us.
Another problem that I find in this space, and I see a lot of people, channels that I like falling victim to it, is that the market mechanism is so transparent in the sense that you get the feedback almost in 5 hours of doing a show, which videos do good and which don't. And then you tend to repeat the same subject over and over.
That's dangerous.
Which is very dangerous, but which has happened to a lot of platforms. So it started off very well. But then over time, they got repetitive because the moment they do a show on Haiti or on Yemen, the numbers are low.
Well, I won't do that.
Yeah.
I did a show on the 100th anniversary of the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses, which I love. I mean, I did a show on Charlie Chaplin. I did part 1 and part 2. We've got to do shows like that. And none of those shows, I did a show on Moby Dick, which I think is the greatest novel ever written. I did a show on Proust. I'm going to do a show on Marx and on Freud, which means I got to go back and make sure I know what I'm talking about. Like a lot of people on the left, I know just enough about Marx to make it look like I understand Marx. But it's a bit of, or Freud. And those shows take tremendous amounts of work, but you can't get seduced by that. And of course, that's the thing with monetization, because if your numbers go up, then you get more money. But there's an essay by the writer Dwight MacDonald called Mass Cult, Mid Cult. So Dwight McDonald, do you know who he is?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was wonderful. And he founded a magazine called Politics, which lasted for 5 years. It never had much of a circulation, but he published Hannah Arendt and Bruno Bettelheim and George Orwell and all that.
He was probably cited by Noam Chomsky in
that's what
responsibility of intellectuals.
Yes, because that magazine was enlightened a young Noam Chomsky. So there, and in Mass Cult, Mid Cult, he said, don't fall for this seduction of reaching the mass, because it's not the numbers, it's who you reach. I mean, I don't know that Dwight McDonald knew who Noam Chomsky was. Probably not.
Right.
And I certainly follow that model, that we have to be true. I mean, I 90 plus, maybe 95% of what I have done, both in my writing and on my shows, has been the genocide. And I've lost viewers, I've lost subscribers to Substack, and Substack's been key to keeping me alive. But I'm not going to stop. I mean, the same thing with Julian. I mean, year after year, I never stopped with whatever was happening. I flew to London to cover the court cases I had to pay for it. I mean, it was expensive. I went to London, I sat in the court, covered those cases. And we have to decide what's important, and not allow, powerful media platforms to determine content or seduce us into providing content that gets numbers or revenue. That will kill us. And you're right, it's killed a lot of platforms that started out with some kind of integrity and then got seduced. And that is a kind of insidious backdoor form of censorship, which we don't want.
I'm so glad you discussed about the pitfalls of the space that we inhabit in the digital world, because a lot of times people get too excited too soon because they see that some of these small platforms made an impact in their thought process, and they think that, now the New York Times is totally disempowered, and which is never the case.
No.
And also the vulnerability in our own circle, which also brings me to your earlier point that it's important to be self-reflective, and whether it's the new atheist or anyone else, if that process is gone, that's the decline. So my question, and I'm coming to an end, is what's your criticism of the tradition of the left? And I'm asking this given I'm very curious, given you relate with the left, but you also constantly say that we have to think independently. We can't do hand-waving stuff. There are times you would say communism is a religion, and I understand what you mean. I feel sometimes that can be flattening, given the tradition of communism in the global south in particular cannot be reduced. If you compare what happened in the Soviet Union with comparable stages of developing countries, they did far better in terms of providing education, in terms of providing housing, in terms of sanitizing their streets out of extreme destitution. You see that in China today. I was in Beijing for 3 months, and I walked the streets relentlessly, and I couldn't find a single person who was begging. And I'm not exaggerating. I went to like 12 to 13 different cities. I couldn't find slums. I'm not saying that there are no problems. But when you compare that experience with that of India, for instance, you really get the meaning that the communism as a movement had a lot of success.
But is China communist anymore?
Okay, that's that's an open question.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's more corporate totalitarianism. But that doesn't negate any of the, successes of China in terms of lifting people out of poverty. On the other hand, they run giant sweatshops where workers are abused, live in dormitories. So again, there is no utopia. There is no perfect society. And that's why, in the end, I define myself as an anarchist, because it's a constant opposition to power in whatever form it takes. That, those of us who are intellectuals are eternal heretics. There are always, even the most well-meaning forms of power, because of the nature of power, engage in suppression. And that our job is always to be with those people who are being repressed or oppressed or, demonized. Or that's where our job is to hold power accountable as journalists, to quote Amir.
Yeah, I see that, and I completely follow that. And I think that is very fundamental within the left tradition, given the left has not held power for the longest.
But that's not true, because the left will go to places like, I saw it. They'll go, for instance, to Nicaragua under the Sandinistas. Mm-hmm. Now, the Sandinistas, when I covered the Contra War there and I covered the war in Salvador, they didn't engage in, a fraction of the human rights abuses that were daily occurring in El Salvador. So the left would go to El Salvador and be good. I mean, they go to the prisons. What they wrote up was true. I mean, the death squads, when I got to Salvador, they were killing 700 people a month. Then they go to Nicaragua and just fall on their knees. And George Orwell writes about this. And now the Sandinistas, they were not good toward the Mosquito Indians. It doesn't compare. I'm not comparing it. I'm just saying that we shred our credibility by not holding the same rigorous standard. This is really Orwell's book, Homage to Catalonia, where he writes about the suppression of the POUM, which he was a member of, the anarchist units, and the Barcelona riots. And Victor Golantz, his publisher, wouldn't publish it because it didn't make the Republican government of Spain look good. And he said, look, and you talked about Coburn. Coburn's father invented stories to support that. And I come down with Orwell, that in the end, our credibility is key. And that, I used to say to these activists who came to Nicaragua, don't do this. You're falling into the trap, because they want to show that you're just useful idiots. And it discredits everything you've reported in Salvador, which is true. So the left is not always. The left is seduced. I mean, they would go to Cuba. They would go to the old China. They used to take tours under Mao. And, they kind of lost all discernment and lost all critical faculties because, and I still think that happens. I see it with people who even go, worship Ortega. I knew Ortega. He was a gangster then. He's a gangster now. Mm-hmm. So the left is as seduced by, let's call it militarism as the right. It's just militarism against empire.
I completely take your point that when it comes to things like militarism, when it comes to things like human rights abuses, dismantling or annihilating your opponents, these things, or even if we are flying aircrafts, for instance, the left and the right can be equally damaging. That's one segment of it. But when I think about the traditions of the left, I think about economic systems. I think about, you spoke about low wage in China. That's a very flat picture, because if you look at historical trajectory of Chinese wage, it has sharply risen since the reform and opening. Now, when you compare that flat rate with the U.S., then of course it is held down, because the model, after all, China adopted through reform and opening was the export-led model, which essentially meant holding down wage compared to if it had come from a domestic consumption-led growth. But you can't compare China to a utopia. You have to compare Chinese wage with Indian wage. And Chinese wage compared to Indian wage, for instance, is far higher than even their nominal comparison of the GDP. So if Chinese GDP is on PPP terms like 5 times that of India, wages of Chinese workers are much more than 5 times that of India. You have to think about the universalization of healthcare. I did 19 checkups in China, including the echocardiography and stuff like that, blood test, HIV. It cost me 3,300 Indian rupees, which is like 330 yuan. Even by nominal terms, in India, it cost you 4 times higher. One of my first exposure when I landed in the United States was I met this nice couple in a neighborhood in Chicago who recently got diagnosed with diabetes. And we talk about their lives, and they said this biggest misery in our life is that we can't buy insulin. Insulin is not even a problem in actually even not even in India, because we didn't hold the intellectual property rights of those generic drug makers. You can buy insulin here. So what I'm saying is, if you look at the long history of the left, I agree with you when it comes to suppression of facts. If you look at the famines, whether it's in socialist regimes or whether it's in colonial regimes, they are equally bad. But what I feel, and that makes me a committed leftist, is then when you look at the sum total, the balance sheet, there is something within both the empirical result, track record of the left and the vision of the left that makes it stand apart from the right. I would love your response.
So what you've just reiterated is that section in Brothers Karamazov of the Grand Inquisitor. So do human beings want bread or freedom? Because you don't have freedom in China. That means complete suppression of dissent.
What do you mean? I mean,
I haven't been to China, so I'm a little reluctant.
When you say you don't have freedom in China.
You don't have the freedom of dissent. I mean,
okay.
You don't have it. I mean, in my understanding, and I've never been to China, so.
But freedom of dissent and freedom is freedom is a bigger subset. When you have housing, when you have healthcare, when you have food, when you can send your kids, and I think this is where I think the place we are coming from, because you are from the global north, where some of the material accessibility in general, I know there is deep inequality here as well. But for instance, one of the things that impressed me, I'll tell you this story, was when I was learning Chinese at Tsinghua, and I left my charging cable that I used to charge my phone on the power, and I went to my class, and a lady, Tsinghua is pretty elite, she came to my room and she cleaned my room, and she left a notice saying, by leaving that charger at the power, you put the whole building in an electrical hazard. Now, I, coming from India, felt 3 things. A woman in her mid-40s can write. You can go all over India. You can find one person who cleans your toilet who can actually even read, let alone write. That's a challenge. That's great freedom. Michael Parenti talks about this in his books. The second is, but that's not a great freedom when you look at it from the perspective of global north, because here you have working class who can actually read and write.
Right.
The second thing is where someone who cleans your toilet can actually give you a notice. In places as hierarchical as in India and much of the Latin American global south, which is much more hierarchical than global north, you can't imagine someone who cleans your toilet can give you a notice. The immediate response is, who the hell are you? Do you know yourself? Which again, I can imagine like someone in the US, as hierarchical as it is divided between the 1% and the rest, you can imagine these things. Like there are things like rules and stuff that work. So when we talk about freedom, the discussion has to, I completely take your point about dissidents. You cannot rebel against the Communist Party, just as you cannot lead an insurrection against. This is not to justify the clampdown on the freedom of expression in China. I hate that. I also hate the overall disempowerment of the working class in China. Yes, they gained in terms of real wage, but politically they are disempowered. What I'm saying is, I find sometimes some of these blanket disregard of socialist states, particularly in the global south, a little bit problematic. Your response?
Well, I mean, so it's about 100 pages in the Brothers Karamazov, and he doesn't come to an answer.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've read it, but
No.
There's no answer. And there's no answer for precisely the reasons that you just raised. How important is freedom of expression? To probably the vast majority of people, it's not that important. But if you are going to propel your society forward and not intellectually and maybe spiritually calcify, it's vital. So I would not, as bad as it is here, if I was Chinese, I would have no voice at all. I believe. The way I critique systems of power here.
Right.
It'd be over. So I'm speaking from a very personal perspective. This is what I've done my whole life. It's all I've ever wanted to do. It would not be achievable within that system.
Right.
That doesn't take away from all the very important points that you made. But it does get to that age-old question, which Dostoevsky asked. I once was with Susan Sontag, and we decided to, which was just a silly parlor game, but we were about to go into Sarajevo, and it was being hit with a lot of shells, and we were scared. And it was the night before we went in. We decided to decide what was the greatest novel ever written, which was silly. But it was the Brothers Karamazov for that reason, that it asked that question that you just raised, which is the most vital question for human existence. And I would hazard a guess that for the majority of people, the ability to read, write, is more important than, let's call it, freedom of expression, but not for me. I've almost died for,
Right.
I don't want to be overly dramatic, but Sarajevo was very dangerous. El Salvador was very dangerous, and I went there, and many of my colleagues did die, because I wanted to give a voice to people who were fleeing. So I don't want to take away any of the points that you made, all of which are important. But from my personal perspective, that form of society would crush my being. And I do think freedom of expression and freedom for dissent is important. However, if you are living on a street and you don't have housing and you don't have adequate income or food or medical care, those are fundamental necessities that have to be met first. I agree. Yeah.
I agree with you that different elements of freedom cannot be made negotiable. Like, one can't say that we offered you economic freedom and we take away your freedom of expression.
But I don't know if it's freedom. I think it's more, I mean, I look at healthcare or housing as a human right.
Okay.
I don't think it's freedom. I think that in an equitable and fair society, it's a right. And this is the tragedy. We've abrogated those rights here in the United States, whereas a country like China respects them. But it wasn't just China. I mean, even if you went to the old Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, I mean, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, those corporations could not raid Eastern and Central Europe fast enough because they had a highly educated population. And they all went to university for free, by the way. So, and then, of course, in the name of neoliberalism, they stripped away everything that was good about communism. Destroyed the educational system, destroyed the healthcare system.
Simply privatized national corporations.
Exactly. So there were, in socialist societies, these, this respect for what I would call essential human rights, which capitalist societies have never respected. And And I think that given a choice, of course, and I think you're right to compare it to India. Given a choice, people will say, "Yeah,
Right.
but not me. I can't." But I've never suffered that level of economic deprivation either. And if I did, if I was living on a sidewalk in New York City and couldn't get medication for whatever ailments I needed, and I couldn't get adequate food, and police were harassing and beating me,
right.
and of course, those are basic necessities that that have to come first.
One of our goals when we started off the platform, and that's why we named India and Global Left, we kept the part India because of the very principle that you said of being self-reflective. We kept it to not hide our place, that all the grotesque things that are happening in our society, we are part of that, and we should be accountable to that. And at the same time, we kept global because we felt genuinely that there are a lot of good ideas, at least in the global north, that doesn't necessarily get through in the global south, because it's the earlier it used to be Force and the World Bank. Now it's the Zuckerbergs and Tim Cooks that have made the biggest inroads and contacts with the global south. And good ideas in the global north often doesn't reach the global south. And at the same time, we also felt that some of the good ideas in the global north has to be critiqued in a comradely manner from the global south, because some of them are inadequate when looked at from the perspective of global majority. Just for an example is that within many of the American left, you find a total fascination with the post-war kind of Keynesian capitalism as the golden age of capitalism, which is true. I mean, you can look at it and compare with the neoliberal period, and you get it in terms of employment, in terms of wage. But in the global south, you don't have an equivalence of that. You don't have that golden phase of capitalism, of industrial capitalism, because colonialism impoverished it, the global south. And those who industrialized rapidly at least, largely moved away from capitalism, and they industrialized much more rapidly. So the point I'm getting at is even that kind of abundance that has been built in the Americas. There are books about American abundance, the very high growth from 1850s onwards. It was unstoppable. Like if you look at the causes of the Depression, a lot of that was overproduction. Prices were depressed so much that there has to be regulations to keep the prices up. You look at the global south, it's the exact opposite. The factors of production are so underdeveloped that there is scarcity all the time. And that's where I think I want to end by asking this final question. When you said I'm an anarchist, we feel that it is very unreasonable to think about some degree of centralization. I'm not talking about eliminating dissidents. I'm not talking about those things. I'm thinking in lines of when there is power shortage, when you are not sitting at the surplus oil reserve or all this whatever through fracking technology and stuff, and you want to industrialize, then you need to place limits or coordinate between a steel industry and the coal industry. And who does that? One way of doing that is the market mechanism, which should exist, and it works, but it doesn't work perfectly. So you need something to balance that. You can look at the stock market as well. The Chinese stock markets are constantly intervened by the party, sometimes by buying massive amount of stocks by state financial institutes, because Alibaba is getting too big to have undue influence, and they don't like it. But the Chinese state said that we are going to buy stocks forcibly to keep power out of this money game. Sometimes banks are instructed to give credits to keep the stock markets floated, because if that's so, what I'm saying is, in a scarcity condition, it's difficult to think about a world which is perfectly anarchistic. I can think about a world perfectly anarchistic and operating through this voluntary exchange in an abundant world where general levels of access to resources are generally greater. That's my last question. I would be interested in
I don't
yours.
endorse an anarchist state. No anarchist movement, including in Spain, the anarchists in Spain wouldn't even run for office.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying I'm personally an anarchist.
But not the society's organization.
No, I don't think there's any example of an effective, Kropotkin maybe, but these are very limited. He talks about consensus only being possible among a group of 100. He actually puts a number on it, 150. And then when you move beyond that, it's essentially paralysis. I do like the old, immediately after the Russian Revolution, the old Soviets, where workers control their own factories, which, of course, Lenin and the Bolsheviks destroyed in what Noam Chomsky calls a counter-revolution. But I think all intellectuals have to be anarchists in the sense that they can't be beholden to power in any way, or controlled by power, or dependent upon power, because it destroys their ability to be intellectually honest. Mm-hmm. But anarchism as a system, it doesn't have much going for it. And in fact, it's the old communist systems, whether it's in Cuba or whether it's in the old Soviet Union, or and I lived in the former Yugoslavia, which, created a kind of equity. You still had, as Evangelos called it, the new class. It's a longer discussion. But, one of the things I noticed when I was in Central and Eastern Europe is that all the kids went to summer camp. Mm-hmm. And they didn't pay. Everybody went. There's something so beautiful and human about that. Everybody had, as you said, access to healthcare. But I think that for those of us who seek intellectual independence and intellectual integrity, we have to define ourselves as anarchists or eternal heretics, is maybe another way to put it. That we're just a thorn in the side of whoever's in power. Mm-hmm. Even though we may be more sympathetic to one system. Right. I'm very critical of Bernie Sanders, but I think Bernie Sanders' commitment to the working class is real. I don't think he makes it. I don't think he's disingenuous. However, I'm very critical of his decision to stay in the Democratic Party, to not challenge the military-industrial complex, to talk about a political revolution, and then as soon as Clinton becomes the nominee, he campaigns for Clinton. I found that really difficult to swallow. Mm-hmm. Political revolutions are not, number one, not created in an election cycle, and number two, obviously, was not being honest with us. In that sense. Yeah.
In that same spirit of anarchism of mind and freedom of thought, we try to have this conversation with you. We admire your work.
Thanks.
We seek more. We try to seek more clarity on certain points. And Chris Hedges, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.
All right.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotish, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.